He strutted across the Cotton Club stage in a white tuxedo, a grin bright as the brass behind him, his voice ricocheting through America with that irrepressible hi-de-ho. To a nation clawing its way out of hard years, Cab Calloway was spectacle and swagger and pure, kinetic joy. His zoot suit swayed, his baton slashed the air, and for a few electric minutes at a time, ballrooms forgot their worries and followed his tempo. But the ovations that crowned him in public could not follow him home. Away from the footlights, there were doors closed, phones unanswered, birthdays missed, and 5 girls growing up in the long, shifting shadow of a legend. What becomes of the children of a man who belongs to the stage? Do they step forward to carry his flame? Or do they learn to live where the light doesn't reach? Cab Calloway's 5 daughters, born across marriages and years, some connected by blood and some by choice, found very different answers to the same question. One would dare the stage and pay the price of comparison. Another would choose the quiet safety of privacy. Others would teach, archive, preserve, and reconcile pride with absence. This is not a story about music charts. It is a story about inheritance, the visible kind and the kind that haunts a room after the applause fades. Cab Calloway was a man who seemed to belong more to the stage than to any one home. His booming voice and dazzling showmanship electrified ballrooms, but behind the curtain was a family scattered across decades, marriages, and circumstances. In total, Cab fathered 5 daughters, each entering the world at a different chapter of his life, and each forced to find her own way under the heavy glow of his fame. The first was Camay Calloway Murphy, born in 1927 to Cab and Zelma Proctor. She arrived before her father's career had fully taken flight, and before the glamour of the Cotton Club could soften the social stigma of being born outside marriage. Just a year later, Cab married his first wife, Winona Betty Conacher, and together they adopted a daughter, Constance. For a brief time, it seemed like the Calloway name could anchor a traditional household. But when the marriage dissolved in 1949, Constance was left with a surname tied to legend, yet a family foundation fractured. That same year, Cab remarried. With his second wife, Zulme Nuffy McNeil, he built a home in Long Island and later Westchester County. Here came 3 more daughters. Chris, born in 1945, who would inherit her father's passion for performance. Cecilia Lael Eulalia, whose life would unfold far more privately. And Cabella, born in 1952, who would become a custodian of her father's cultural memory. 5 daughters. 5 different paths. Some bore his features, some bore his name, and all bore the paradox of being born to a man who belonged to everyone but them. For while the world adored the hi-de-ho man, his children grew up with the more complicated truth that the applause often came at the expense of presence. Number 5. Cabella Calloway. Born in 1952, Cabella Calloway entered the world when her father's fame had already reached its twilight. The golden glow of the Cotton Club era was fading, yet Cab was still a household name, still carrying the energy of jazz into new decades. For Cabella, that meant being born not into the rise of a legend, but into the long shadow of one. Her childhood was spent in Westchester County, where Cab and his second wife, Zulme Nuffy McNeil, tried to raise a more settled family life. Yet the demands of Cab's career, even as it slowed, meant he was often absent. Cabella grew up surrounded by the echoes of a legacy she hadn't asked for, a surname that carried pride but also weight. Unlike her sister Chris, who pursued the stage, Cabella chose a quieter but equally significant path. She found her calling in education and cultural preservation. She worked as a teacher and later became deeply involved in community arts, devoting herself to keeping alive the jazz traditions that her father had once embodied. In many ways, she became a bridge, connecting Cab Calloway's roaring 20s and 30s with generations who only knew his music from records and archives. But this role was a double-edged sword. Every time she spoke about jazz or took part in a community project, she was introduced as Cab Calloway's daughter. The question lingered. Were people listening to her voice or to the echo of her father's? Cabella bore that paradox with dignity. She didn't chase stardom, but she accepted the responsibility of memory. In her later years, she became known as a quiet guardian of the Calloway legacy. Yet in doing so, she sacrificed something of her own identity. Her death in 2023 closed the final chapter of Cab Calloway's children, marking the loss not just of a daughter, but also of a steward of history. Cabella's story reminds us that legacy is not only about fame and applause. Sometimes it is about the unseen work of preservation, the steady hands that keep the music alive when the spotlight has long since dimmed. Number 4. Cecilia Lael Calloway. Cecilia Lael Eulalia Calloway grew up in the same household as her sister Chris, but from the very beginning, her instincts carried her in a different direction. Born into the glow of her father's fame, she was surrounded by music, rehearsals, and the constant reminders that Cab Calloway was larger than life. Yet rather than embrace that spotlight, Lael deliberately turned away from it. Unlike Chris, who took to the stage, Lael sought refuge in privacy. She rarely gave interviews, rarely appeared in public, and never tried to carve out a performance career of her own. Her silence, however, was not without meaning. To grow up as the daughter of one of jazz's most flamboyant figures meant living under constant comparison. By stepping back, Lael may have been choosing self-preservation over the endless expectations that crushed so many children of fame. There is little public record of Lael's adult life, and perhaps that was her intention. What is known is that she avoided the entertainment world altogether, preferring to live quietly, out of reach from the endless demands of media and public curiosity. For some, that might seem like an absence of story. But in truth, it is a different kind of story, a quiet rebellion against the machinery of celebrity. Still, her choice came with costs. When your surname is Calloway, recognition follows you whether you seek it or not. Yet Lael never used that recognition to open doors. Instead, she lived a life defined by discretion. For historians, her story is a puzzle with missing pieces. For her, perhaps it was freedom. Lael represents the children of fame who choose invisibility over performance. She reminds us that survival sometimes means retreating, refusing to be defined by a legacy that belongs more to the world than to the family itself. Her absence from the stage, from the headlines, from the narrative of celebrity is not a void. It is a statement. Number 3. Chris Calloway. Born in 1945 to Cab Calloway and his second wife Zulmi "Nuffy" McNeil, Chris Calloway was the daughter who decided not to shy away from her father's world, but to step directly into it. From a young age, she was surrounded by the rhythms of jazz, and unlike her sister Lael, she embraced the stage with passion. She sang, she danced, she performed, determined to prove that the Calloway fire did not end with her father. Chris carried his charisma and musical instincts, but with them came an almost unbearable weight, constant comparison. Every time she performed, audiences and critics asked the same question: was she as good as Cab? To live as an echo of a legend is one of the cruelest tests a performer can face. Chris herself once pushed back, declaring, "I am not my father's copy." It was a simple sentence, but it carried a lifetime of resistance. Her career took her across jazz clubs and theater stages. She even shared the spotlight with her father on Broadway in the 1967 production of Hello, Dolly, where she played Minnie Fay opposite Cab's Horace Vandergelder. Later, she built her own following, admired for her warmth, her voice, and her resilience. For those who saw her, Chris was not just Cab's daughter. She was a woman carving out her own place in jazz and theater. But behind the applause was struggle. Living in her father's artistic world meant she could never fully escape his shadow. And then came a harsher battle: breast cancer. For years, she fought the illness, performing when she could, refusing to let the disease silence her. Her determination earned admiration from peers and audiences alike, yet the fight took its toll. In 2008, Chris Calloway passed away at just 62 years old. Her story is both heartbreaking and inspiring. Heartbreaking because her life was cut short, and she never fully escaped the comparisons that haunted her. Inspiring because despite it all, she stood on stage and insisted on being herself. For every note she sang, she reminded the world that children of legends are not meant to be replicas. They are meant to be seen as individuals. Chris Calloway's legacy is one of defiance and courage. Though she may never have reached the global renown of her father, she achieved something just as important: the respect of those who saw her fight to define herself in her own right. Number 2. Constance Calloway. Constance Calloway entered the Calloway household not by blood, but by adoption. She was brought into the family during Cab's first marriage to Winona Betty Conacher in the late 1920s, a time when his career was just beginning to skyrocket. At first glance, being adopted by a rising star might have seemed like fortune, but for Constance, it was a far more complicated story. She carried the Calloway name, but not the Calloway blood. And in a home where her father was constantly on the road, larger than life to the public but distant in private, that difference mattered. The applause that followed Cab into every ballroom could not fill the silences in their living room. For Constance, those silences were reminders that belonging in a famous family is not always guaranteed. When Cab and Betty divorced in 1949, the fracture deepened. Constance was suddenly suspended between two worlds. She was no longer central to the family, and yet she carried a name forever tied to the man who raised her. The shadow of adoption meant her place was conditional, and that conditionality seemed to follow her throughout life. Unlike her siblings, Constance did not step into the spotlight. In fact, she retreated from it almost entirely. The public record of her later years is nearly blank, a silence that in itself tells a story. While others tried to preserve, resist, or build upon their father's legacy, Constance seemed to vanish into privacy. Perhaps it was by choice, a way to escape the heavy burden of comparison. Or perhaps it was the quiet ache of never feeling fully claimed. Her story is not one of scandal or tragedy, but of erasure. She reminds us that sometimes the cost of being the child of a legend is not being overshadowed, it is being forgotten altogether. Today, little is remembered of Constance Calloway, but her absence forces us to ask, what does it mean to bear a famous name, but not a famous bloodline? Shadows come in many forms. For Constance, the shadow was silence. Number 1. Camay Calloway Murphy. Before Cab Calloway became the Heidi-Ho man, before the Cotton Club fame and the Zoot Suits, there was Camay Calloway Murphy. Born in 1927 to Cab and Zelma Proctor, she was his first child, and she came into the world outside of marriage, in an era when that fact carried a heavy social stigma. For Camay, her father's dazzling fame was always paired with the painful reality that her very existence was a secret the world wasn't meant to celebrate. As Cab's career soared, Camay grew up learning the art of silence. While audiences shouted his name, she rarely spoke of him. Every newspaper headline praising his genius reminded her that she lived in the margins of his story. For a child, absence is already a wound. For Camay, that absence was magnified by the knowledge that everyone knew her father, but few knew her place in his life. Yet she refused to let that shadow define her. Instead of chasing spotlights, Camay built a career in education. She became a teacher, then a principal, and eventually a respected leader in cultural and artistic communities. Where she had once lacked belonging, she gave others a place to belong. Her classrooms became stages of a different kind, ones filled not with applause but with young lives shaped by her resilience. The bond between Camay and Cab was never simple. Recognition from him came late and never fully filled the years of distance. Still, she carried herself with dignity. When she passed away in 2017, she left behind not just her family and students, but also the testimony of endurance. Camay's story is proof that the children of legends are not defined solely by fame. Some carve legacies of their own, far from the stage. She may not have commanded orchestras or lit up theaters, but she lit up classrooms, one student at a time. And in doing so, she showed that even in the deepest shadow of celebrity, there is room for a quiet, steady light. The lives of Cab Calloway's 5 daughters tell a story that fame itself often refuses to admit. Every spotlight casts a shadow, and it is within those shadows that the deepest struggles unfold. Camay, born outside of marriage, transformed her private wound into a public gift through education. Constance, adopted but never fully embraced, slipped quietly into near erasure, her silence as haunting as any scandal. Chris, bold and determined, dared to step into the same world as her father, only to battle the crushing weight of comparison and the cruel hand of illness. Lael, refusing the spotlight altogether, chose privacy as her form of survival. And Cabella, the youngest, carried the family torch as a cultural steward, ensuring that jazz history was preserved even if her own name was overlooked. Together, their stories reveal the paradox of being born to a legend. To the world, Cab Calloway was joy, rhythm, and unstoppable energy. To his children, he was presence and absence all at once. A father loved by millions but rarely claimed in the intimacy of home. What remains is not just the music he left behind, but the resilience his daughters embodied. Each, in her own way, found a path to endure the legacy she never chose. Some embraced it, some resisted, some preserved it, and some escaped it. And so, when we remember the roar of Minnie the Moocher, we should also pause for the quieter echoes. The classrooms Camay filled, the silence Constance carried, the fire Chris burned, the privacy Lael protected, and the heritage Cabella safeguarded. Their lives remind us that the true measure of legacy is not only in applause, but in survival. Because behind every icon stands a family, and behind every legend are children who must learn to live in the glow and the shadow of greatness.